Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance (ESG). This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, Andrea Torres Villanueva, an associate director on KBRA's ESG team, speaks with Bill Cox, KBRA's global head of corporate, financial, and government ratings, and Andrew Giudici, the global head of corporate, project, and infrastructure finance at KBRA. Bill and Andrew highlight findings from a recent KBRA research publication, It is Time to Measure the Real Impact of a Carbon Tax, that details how corporations use internal carbon pricing, the challenges with carbon pricing, and how regulatory efforts to reduce global emissions may impact a corporation's financial performance.
Welcome, Bill and Andrew, and thanks for joining me today to talk about carbon. So for many economists and policymakers, the best way to shift away from fossil fuels and reduce emissions is to put a price on carbon. So Bill, why is putting a price on carbon one of the most effective and efficient ways to lower emissions?
It's a great question. Carbon pricing aims to reduce the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere by making it more expensive to create the emissions in the first place. And economists have long suggested that assigning a price to CO2 emissions is a pretty cost-effective way and overall effective way to curb emissions. In fact, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has said that setting a price on carbon in the U.S. is probably the most critical step to managing the risks that climate change pose. And the aim overall of pricing, whether in the form of a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, is to put a price on emissions so that the costs of the impact that carbon has on climate and the costs of transitioning to a lower carbon economy are reflected in everyday production and consumption choices. And a carbon pricing system would force producers to internalize the externalities, their impact on the environment of their production decisions. And while consumers would also feel that impact in the form of pricing and their own consumption decisions would likely be impacted. So as the cost of emitting carbon becomes more transparent and expensive, producers and consumers would be incented to seek alternatives, such as developing new technologies or reducing their overall emissions impact. Overall, pricing policies can help achieve emissions reduction goals that international commitments such as the Paris Agreement call for. And whether or not that takes the form of a carbon tax or a cap and trade program is probably less important than essentially assigning some cost to emissions and consumption of activities that release carbon into the atmosphere. And if well designed, whether it is a carbon tax or a cap and trade program or some derivative of either of those things, it's likely to be the most effective way to really incent the economy to be in line with climate and energy transition goals.
Thanks, Bill. And we actually have a research piece that details each of these carbon pricing mechanisms that you were talking about. It's on our website. It's called Carbon Pricing and Its Potential Credit Impact. And I would encourage listeners to read this piece if they're interested in learning more. So Andrew, there's a mechanism and an internal carbon price by which companies or entities can put a value on their emissions. So can you tell us what is an internal carbon price and why do companies use them?
Andrea, internal carbon prices are mechanisms used by companies to assess the potential financial impact of expansions in environmental regulations. There are a few different types of internal carbon prices that are used, but the most common is a shadow price. This is basically applies to a theoretical price of carbon. Most companies right now are using a $100 per metric carbon ton. And what's done under this example is they basically assign the $100 per metric carbon ton to their scope 1 and 2 emissions internally and figure out if they had to pay a penalty assessed at $100, what would the financial impact be? There's also another strategy that's used, which is an implicit price. This applies to a tax on certain carbon-intensive activities, for example, transportation and heating that may take place within a particular organization to measure the potential regulatory impact. This strategy also considers how much it would cost a company to switch its electricity consumption to renewables. For example, a company might determine how much electricity that they're consuming, and if they had to offset that through the purchase of renewable energy, how much it would cost. Another scenario is an internal fee, and this applies to an internal price to penalize different divisions for their carbon emissions. And this is basically a penalty to try to ensure certain groups reduce the amount of carbon emitting activities within their particular area. And the last scenario is an offset. And these are carbon credits where a company could actually purchase in the secondary market, which could be used to offset their carbon emissions. And as I mentioned, this is done through purchasing credits or changing business practices internally. But no matter what approach a company uses to calculate its exposure to future regulations, the first step is determining what their scope 1, 2, and or 3 emission levels are. That's where the tax will ultimately be applied against.
Thanks, Andrew. And it seems that there are multiple benefits on setting an internal carbon price, but what are some of the challenges with this?
Sure. While many companies now report internal carbon prices, there's no agreed upon accounting or regulatory standard guiding their methodology or measurement technique. Also, internal carbon prices are sometimes more linked to public relation efforts than to meaningful changes in operations or technologies. It also would be helpful if there was a standardized approach for calculating internal carbon pricing. This would provide investors with better insight into a company's exposure to emission regulations, while also allowing them to compare prices easily across industries. We believe that prices that are consistently updated would also provide insight to a company's ability to reduce its emissions and achieve its stated goals. It's critical that while now companies are stating their intent to reduce their emissions over time, it's important to be able to track and evaluate management's ability to execute on their strategy. And we think that most companies are going to need to provide this level of reporting going forward in order to access the capital markets as investors shift to environmentally focused companies.
Thanks, Andrew. And Bill, what's wrong with analyzing a company just in terms of emissions? So what's the alternative?
Well, the reality is that emissions vary dramatically by industry, and there are also large gaps in the availability of emissions disclosure. So just looking at a company from the perspective of what emissions they do disclose also needs to factor in a very important reality, and that is the size of the company and its capacity and its performance overall, and how these emissions fit into that context. There are countless examples of very, very large companies with what might seem like enormous amounts of emissions that are actually very manageable from a financial perspective, but their emissions might seem very large. So ESG scoring systems or other rubrics that just ding a company because of its emissions count, but don't put that count into context, are flawed. So the reality is companies need to think about the trade-off between paying a carbon tax or taking measures internally to reduce emissions. And in certain cases, it may be more cost effective for companies to implement a capital expenditure program and switch to alternative forms of energy or eliminate certain business lines rather than pay a carbon tax. Or for other companies, it may be cost effective to pay the carbon tax during a period of transition.
Yeah, and Andrew, how can we measure the economic impact of potential carbon regulation on a corporation?
It's a great question. It's probably best to answer with an example. If we look at Exxon, in 2019, they reported scope 1 and 2 emissions of around 120 million metric tons of carbon. And based upon these levels and a shadow price of carbon at $100, the company would have had to pay around $12 billion in carbon taxes. This conservatively assumes that there were no allowances and that the company did not purchase any offsets. So it's an extremely conservative scenario. And while a carbon tax of $12 billion is substantial, Exxon generated around $264 billion of revenue and around $40 billion of EBITDA during this time period. So given its strong cash flow position, it could have easily paid the carbon tax from cash flow from operations. Now, however, the same might not be true if the company had to pay a similar tax in 2020. During this period, its EBITDA fell to around $18.3 billion, And when you compare that to a $12 billion carbon tax, it is the cushion has come down significantly. And also taking this further, during this period, the company's debt to EBITDA ratio was around 3.7 times, which would have increased to over 10 times if it had to pay a $12 billion carbon tax. So just thinking about it from a credit perspective and debt to EBITDA alone, you could see how much the company's credit would have deteriorated if they had to go ahead with this $12 billion carbon tax in 2020. And while these are all extreme scenarios, we mention it to illustrate the impact the carbon tax could have on the credit quality of an individual company, depending upon its revenue and earning potential.
Thank you, Andrew. That was actually really helpful. And Bill, I have one final question for you. How does KBRA think about the regulatory environment around carbon emissions in its credit analysis?
Andrea, given the uncertainties around the eventual implementation of carbon pricing, and certain in the context of recent events, it seems even more distant from now. It's still too soon to gauge the full effect of what kind of scheme will be implemented on the credit risk of U.S. issuers. Overall, we believe it can be a credit positive when issuers demonstrate awareness of and planning for potential regulatory actions, including carbon pricing, that may impact their credit quality. In the case of how carbon pricing may impact an issuer, we'll evaluate the specific industry and the management team strategy under different carbon pricing scenarios, as well as how it may impact their business. And for this reason, we believe that the near-term impact of climate risk on corporate credit ratings is extremely complex and cannot be reduced to a simple ESG score for reasons I described earlier. The ESG management framework that we use to assess ESG risks, including carbon and climate transition issues, focuses on the ability of companies, management teams, or a transaction sponsor to identify, plan for, and then mitigate the ongoing risks associated with transition and the potential for carbon pricing. And issuers with strategies based on different scenarios of carbon pricing and other potential climate-related regulation will likely better insulate their capacity to generate revenue and profits, more so than those who don't plan and don't conduct scenario analysis. And this is now part of our analysis of many management teams, these kinds of questions about planning and scenario analysis. And in addition to that, we'll be introducing some really interesting ratios that I think put carbon emissions and the costs associated with those carbon emissions on a range of scenarios into proper context of a company's size, its financial capacity, and its operating history. And we'll be sharing more of that with the market soon.
Great. Bill and Andrew, thank you very much for your time and your insights. This has been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you to Andrea, Bill, and Andrew for a very interesting discussion. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter. This concludes our episode. New episodes of ESG Talks air every other week. In the meantime, please visit kbra.com to access our other podcast series, as well as our ratings and research.